There's one word that future historians will be unable to avoid when talking about the early 21st century. It's terrorism. Terrorism is the use of public violence to intimidate and cause terror in the goal of achieving a political aim. Basically, terrorists attempt to create political and social change by threatening the welfare of their opponents. In general, this isn't a clearly issued threat like two nations declaring war, but it often happens through unprovoked acts of violence. Living in fear, that's the basic message of terrorism. But where did this ideology come from? And how did it become such a big part of our world? To understand that, we need to look back further in history than you might suspect. People today often think of terrorism as a modern threat, but there's nothing modern about it. People have been using extreme and public displays of violence to scare and intimidate their opponents for most of human history. First century Jews called zealots tried to overthrow Roman rule through intimidation and assassination. Today, we define a zealot as a person who is fanatical and uncompromising in pursuit of their religious, political, or other ideals. Assassination on holy days was a popular form of intimidation during the era of the Crusades, the preferred method of the sect who became known as the Assassins. And that's the origin of that term. The word terrorism, as we know it, however, originated in France during the Régime de la Terreur, the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, the French Revolution descended into madness as the revolutionary leaders started rounding up and publicly executing dissidents by guillotine. Revolutionary leader Robespierre stated that terror is nothing other than justice. So he was actually justifying the unlawful execution of 40,000 people. The tactics of modern terrorism appeared a little later in 1870s Russia. Those who sought to overthrow the Tsar decided to weaken his government through extreme and public actions of violence, and they intended to do three things. They wanted to destabilize the government, divide the population, and provoke authorities to overreact out of fear. On March 1st, 1881, they succeeded in killing Tsar Alexander II when a bomb was thrown at his carriage. These tactics quickly spread out of Russia, where they were adopted by anarchists, revolutionaries, and dissidents who were oppressed by the Ottoman and British empires. Thus, terrorism first became a global phenomenon as a way to fight imperialism by destabilizing colonial governments, dividing the loyalty of the population, and provoking colonial authorities to overreact. Of course, the concept of terrorism only grew from there. In the early 20th century, anarchist groups started using terrorist attacks to weaken governments. Fascist governments also terrorized their own populations to maintain order. After World War II, terrorism became part of the continuing anti-imperialistic struggle in Africa and West Asia. This is where the history of terrorism, as many people imagine it today, began. Radical groups funded by either the United States or the Soviet Union started utilizing increasingly extreme tactics to weaken communist or capitalist regimes. The Cold War eventually ended, between the United States and the Soviet Union, but radical terrorists kept fighting, emboldened by extremist ideologies and years of financial support from the two global superpowers. This introduced a new form of terrorism in which suicide became a tool of terror, demonstrating the resolve of new terrorist organizations and the lengths that they would go to. In looking through the history of terrorism, we have to acknowledge that this phenomenon is not as easy to define as you'd think. The concept and practice of terrorism has changed at many points throughout history, but in general, we can organize terrorism into two types. First is domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism is an act of extreme and public violence by a citizen of a nation against their own fellow citizens. Perhaps they are trying to demonstrate that they do not feel like members of that nation anymore. They disagree with the direction that their country is headed, or they strongly oppose the government in power. In American history, perhaps the most notable example of domestic terrorism is the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, where perpetrator Timothy McVeigh detonated a bomb in a federal government building, killing 168 people. The other major category is international terrorism, terrorist activities against a foreign government or people. In world history, international terrorism was largely a part of anti-imperialism or anti-colonial struggles, where they meant to scare imperial governments into abandoning their idea and making it too costly to keep fighting. In American history, however, the most obvious example of international violence is 9/11. In September of 2001, members of an extremist sect of Islam flew two planes into the World Trade Center in New York City, one plane into the Pentagon and one plane into a field in Pennsylvania in a failed attempt. Their goal was to destabilize international capitalist markets and the Western world. International terrorism on this scale turned out to be very hard for the United States to deal with. We weren't attacked by a foreign government, so retaliation proved to be extremely difficult. Remember how one of the goals of terrorism is to prompt an overreaction? The American invasion of Iraq met that standard, making the U.S. look more like an imperial aggressor and providing a recruitment opportunity for anti-U.S. terrorist organizations. It's an extremely new sort of warfare, as international terrorism is taking a large role in the way the world interacts today.